Okay, so I want to just very quickly recap what we did last week. We examined the verse, Hebrews 10:25, and we concluded that this verse is concerned about neglecting to meet when we are able to. And so it doesn't apply for situations when we are not able to do it. We're not able to come together because of sickness, our own sickness, or for events beyond our control. And so when we do that, it's not forsaking worship, it's not disobeying this verse. Now, in many churches in the world, I mean, for many Christians in the world today, in many countries, there is persecution and they can't meet either. So when there's a persecution or a pandemic or disaster like an earthquake, you just can't go to church. And so that when it's beyond our control, we are not forsaking worship at all. And some of us quite clearly, even without COVID, when we have a dangerous snowstorm and it is between you and the church, you're not going to travel through a dangerous storm. I know some people do, but generally we don't. Yeah, we don't go to church and we don't feel guilty about it because that is not within our control. So if we now have to forsake worship, to avoid gathering together, that's not forsaking worship because we're helping to prevent the pandemic from spreading further and faster to other people, to endanger the whole community. So keeping our community safe is really one aspect of loving our neighbor, and loving our neighbor is a command that is as important, equally important as the command to worship God. And we know this from Jesus when he spoke in Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 to 40. We also know that when we obey government orders, some people say this is obeying man and that's not right. No, we are not obeying men, we are obeying God here because God ordained governments, God allowed governments, and he appointed governments to keep all of us safe and well. And so when government orders come to keep everyone safe from disease and suffering, that is a command from God, because we read from Romans that governments are appointed by God and God commands us. It is his will. Peter says it is his will that we obey governments because he appointed them to keep us safe and orderly. Now, of course, we also said that Christians do not need to worship in a church in big numbers, because where two or three are gathered in the name of Jesus Christ, we are worshiping and we are in church. So as long as governments are ordering us to stay home because it is to prevent public health from deteriorating, from collapsing, from the health system from collapsing, then it is a government order which we should obey. And to rebel against such orders is to rebel against God. Most important of all, loving our neighbor, as Jesus commands us, is to keep him or her safe and healthy, and sending healing and help to them when they need it, when disease is all around like today. And so when we visit our brothers and sisters, or even non-Christians at this time, we are presenting God, we are representing God also to him or her in his or her time of need. And this is a far better witness than insisting on our right to gather in church. In fact, the non-believers will think we are stupid to be gathering together in church, because when we sing and we shout and we have worship and the sermons, we're spreading saliva all over the place and aerosols all over the place, and this is irresponsible.
Right now, what's happening?
And because this variant now that's happening, which is now a dominant variant, what they call it, the South Asian or the Delta variant, it spreads very fast, and it spreads by aerosols, that means by saliva and breath in the air. So it is totally irresponsible to be out there worshiping in a church when government tells us to stay home and worship at home. So having said that, now I want to move on to the next idea that even if we are free people, God's word says we are free in Christ. Our freedoms are subject to the freedoms that other people have, and that's also a message from the Bible. So 1 Peter 2:16 says, live as people who are free. So we are free. Yeah, we are freed by God, freed from sin, freed, freed from fear, and freed from the fear of death, especially. So we are free people. We should not be afraid. We should not be worried about the disease or dying. But as free people, we're free to worship, even if governments forbid us from worship. Even in that situation, Peter says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover up for evil, but living as servants of God. So we must not be seen even by the world to be evil, because if we help to spread a disease simply by refusing to obey government orders to stay home, to social distance, to wear masks, then we are not living as servants of God. We're not giving a good impression of our God, who is giving us freedom, but freedom subject to other people's freedom. We are free people, but we cannot use our freedom to cover up what is seen as evil. And spreading disease and spreading death is evil. Now, our freedom is also used to serve others, not self-serving, not to serve ourselves. Oh, I'm free and I can do what I want and I will make sure that I am happy and I don't care about you. That's not the Christian message. Our freedom is used to serve other people. So Galatians 5:13 says this, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another. So we are free. We're free to worship. We're free to gather together. We're free from fear. We're free from the fear of death and disease. But we don't use this freedom to stumble other people. We use this freedom to serve others. And that includes helping them to stay safe and healthy. So we don't use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, that means to satisfy our own pleasures and our own likes. The next point is that even when we are right and we have rights, we do not insist on our rights. You know, it is so prevalent in North America to say, my rights prevail over your rights. My rights are my rights, and you don't tell me what to do. It's my life. Stay away from it. It's not your business. So this is a message that North Americans will tell us, whether in Canada or the USA, but this is not a message from God. God doesn't say we are free to do what we want, don't care about others because it's my life. No, that's not a message from God. So let me read to you from 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And the verses say, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. You see, this is about food, but this is also about the idea of me. I know more than you, and I know more about COVID. I know more about vaccines. I know more about science than you, and I insist I'm right. Paul says, when we have knowledge, it blows up our head. It puffs us up. We become proud. That's no good. It is love that will build up, and we should be concerned more about loving the other person rather than knowing more than the other person. Verse 2, if anyone imagines that he knows something he does not yet know as he ought to know. You see, Paul reminds us, you may know a lot, but you still know very little. You do not know what God knows. Verse 4, therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. So this may seem to, on the surface of it, refer to food, in reality, it's a principle applying to other aspects of our life. So Paul was addressing this question. In the city of Corinth, there were butchers that were selling food and meat, and all this had been offered to the idols before they sell it in the market. And the question is, can you eat this food that has been offered to idols? And Paul says, idols have no real existence. Verse 4, there's only one God. Idols are not gods. So don't worry, go eat the food. Don't need to ask. You can eat freely of that food. You have a freedom to eat of that food, even though it has been offered to idols. But then he says, even if you know this, and even if you have a knowledge that there is only one God, idols don't affect you. This knowledge is a superior knowledge, true, but you don't stumble other people who may be weaker than you are. And so when that someone who is weaker in faith or who's a non-Christian says to you, oh, by the way, my food is offered to idols, then Paul says, don't eat it for the sake of the one who informed you. For his sake, for her sake, she or he has a weaker conscience. So your conscience must be subject to that weaker conscience. Then do not eat the food offered to idols, even though you know it's safe to eat. And this is what actually happened in my family. When I became a Christian, my mother was not a Christian at that time, and she worshipped the idols. And every month she would kill a chicken, and then we were very poor, so we only have meat once a month because my mom would sacrifice a chicken to her gods, her idols. And she would, after that, of course, the idols will eat it. The whole family sits down to eat. And my mom, my sweet mom, would always, reserve a drumstick for me. And she says, son, this drumstick has not been offered to my gods. You're a Christian, you're safe to eat it. And of course, I said, Mom, I don't say, Mom, don't worry. I have a God stronger than your idols. I will not worry about this. I didn't say that. For love of my mother and for her love for me, I simply said, Mom, thank you so much for thinking about me. I will eat this drumstick that has not been offered to the idols. So, it's acts of love like this because I appreciate her love, she appreciates my love. In the end, my mom came to Christ. She became a Christian. So for the sake of somebody who does not know Christ, we with a superior knowledge should just keep quiet and appreciate what they do for us. Paul says this another way. All things are lawful, 1 Corinthians 10. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. And here I am trying to build up my mom in her knowledge that my God is bigger than all the idols, but I don't attack her faith. I just demonstrate it by the love of God and with the love of God. And verse 24 says, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. And loving my mother, of course, is more important than just knowing that I am right and she's wrong, right? In the matter of who is the God of the universe. And the same we do if we look after our neighbor, we seek their health, not our own health, not our own right to freely worship in church. We don't need to worship in church. We can worship at home privately. But 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, we can have 2 or 3 Christians gather. Yeah, most of the time, even with the lockdowns, we can have visits with one another in small numbers. But we do this so that the non-believers would come to see that we actually care for them and love them, and we are not going to spread the disease. So Paul says in verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. It's offered to idols? No worries, eat it. It's God's meat. It's God's kingdom. And God is more powerful than the idols that it has been offered to. But then verse 28, I read earlier, but if someone says to you, this has been offered to the idols in sacrifice, then do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. Verse 29 says, not our own conscience as Christians, but the conscience of the non-believer or the person who tells us. So all things may be lawful. It's good to me, for me to go to church, and I'm not afraid of death. I'm not afraid of COVID, but still for the sake of building up my neighbor and his faith in God and his strength and his health, I will subject my own good to his good or her good. And finally, when people tell you, I would rather obey God than man, tell them obeying God here is keeping the social distance rules and staying safe for the sake of other people who may worry more than we do about COVID. So, and we don't judge them and condemn them. And you are so cowardly. You are a Christian, but you are cowering in your home. Come out of your home and come to church with me. Well, God says, do not pass judgment in these issues on a weaker brother or sister who is afraid. Do not stumble them, and do not stumble not just brothers and sisters, but others who are not believers in Jesus. To stumble them is to put a stone in their path. When they walk smoothly, you put a stone in their path and they fall. So putting barriers in their pathway to Jesus, we should not do that. And most of all, do not break fellowship. I am so sad to know that Christians are quarreling with each other because they disagree about the virus and about how to react to the virus, and they break fellowship. They don't become friends anymore. And that is very sad. People would rather break friendship than admit that maybe I could be wrong, or maybe I may be right, but my superior knowledge does not allow me to pass judgment on you, and my superior knowledge does not entitle me to condemn you. Instead, I should stay with you. Yeah, my superior knowledge could well be wrong, but my superior knowledge still should not compel me to break fellowship with you. So in Romans 14, verse 13, Paul says, therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. So this stumbles you. My view is different from your view, and this makes you unhappy, and makes you think that I'm not a good believer in Jesus Christ. All right, I won't talk about it anymore, rather than break the friendship. So I want us all, even if we have the knowledge that I'm talking about, we should not be involved in stumbling and making the faith of a weaker Christian any more weak. The other argument that some people have who are Christians to tell us, don't do online worship, go to physical worship. Online worship is bad. And the reason they give would be, Satan uses technology to blind us. Don't be blinded by Satan. How do we respond to that argument? First of all, to acknowledge that yes, high technology is inadequate for the ministry we have, high touch, high trust. What do I mean by high touch, high trust? We are dealing with people, and we miss it right now, the physical touch. People need the physical, the hug and the physical presence, to be able to see each other's faces, to shake hands, to to hug each other and so on. So it's a high touch ministry, and it's so much different when we counsel, for example, by Zoom, right? It's so much more comforting to know that the person you're talking to is flesh and blood in, right in front of you. So it's a high touch ministry and high trust. You would listen to me because I'm your pastor, but not just that, because you have lived my life, I have lived your life, and so we trust each other, we know each other. And it's a high trust. You won't trust what I say if you didn't trust me. So in this kind of ministry where we need that touch, we need that trust. High tech cannot achieve it. If I'm here 10,000 miles away from you, there is no warmth, there is no touch, and it's so difficult to relate. So true, online worship doesn't fulfill all our needs. And yes, indeed, the devil deceives us. He masquerades, he pretends to be an angel of light. 2 Corinthians 11:14 tells us that. So we need always to watch out for the tricks of the devil. So if technology is a trick of the devil, of course, then we need to be careful about it. But actually, technology is not a trick of the devil. It is the misuse of technology. So yes, the devil may mislead us into abusing technology for evil, but that by itself is not the reason to avoid technology and avoid online worship, when it is one solution to worshiping together in a time of COVID, when we have to stay away from one another. And certainly that doesn't mean we should not invent new technology, or when the technology is invented, we avoid using it. That is not the right conclusion. Technology is neutral. In other words, let's take the knife. Okay, it's very low tech technology, yeah? And the knife can kill. You can murder people with a knife, and murder is a sin. So we should not invent knives. That's ridiculous, isn't it? Because a knife is neutral. You can use it to cut your vegetables and your meat so that you can cook and feed your family and yourselves. Knives are good. It's how we use it that is bad, not the knife itself. The same thing with gas production. Just because gas can be used to kill human beings, and it has indeed been used for genocide, doesn't mean that we should stop producing gas in the factories, because gas can be used for our cooking. Gas can be used to heat up our homes in the cold Canadian winter. Gas itself is neutral, and the technology to produce artificial gas is neutral. It is the misuse and the abuse of technology that makes it evil. So never, never say, I won't use technology because technology is evil. It is not. Technology is neutral, like the knife. The knife can be used to cut your food. It can also be used to kill. So it is the human being who misuses and abuses technology. So just because something can be used for evil does not mean we must reject it. Just because online worship can be used for evil, technology, the internet and online technology can be used for evil, does not mean we should reject it. This technology, in fact, has been very, very particularly useful during this time of COVID, but even before COVID, because it allows us to preach the gospel to countries that are closed to the gospel. There are many countries where they will say, you Christians stay out. The Bible is banned in my country. Christians are banned in my country. But the technology opens up that closed country. It opens up closed families. There are some families that would tell their children and the family members, you stay away from church, you stay away from Christians, or you will die. The family is closed. They would even kill the family members for becoming Christians. But this is a time where with a smartphone or with a computer, with a laptop, with a tablet, you can hear the gospel preached. And maybe your families and the police in your country don't even know about it, because you can access your technology at a time when nobody's watching you. So this technology is in fact opening up the gospel to many more countries where they cannot receive the Bible and preachers. The other thing about this technology is that it enables a visual generation. We have we call them the millennials. The millennials grew up having computers, and they have short attention spans, and the frame must change every 25 seconds. They need that visual generation. needs this medium. Social media, it's Instagram. So instant. It has to be instant. And if you don't reply to somebody's post or email, they don't use email much these days because social media is WhatsApp and Twitter is so much faster and so much more succinct. And you have to respond to them within a few hours. Even if you don't respond the next day, it's you get people asking you, why are you ignoring me? And for people like me, we grew up with, I sent off a letter when I was studying in London. I sent off a letter to say hello to my family and update them on myself. It takes 21 days to arrive in Singapore. And then they read it and they think about the reply for another 2-3 days. And that's 25 days already, and it takes another 21 days to come back to London, and I read the reply 2 months later, right? So yeah, that was the state of our communication in the 80s when I was studying overseas. And now people expect you to reply within hours, and if you don't, they think you ignore them. So this is a generation that expects the medium to respond instantly to them. And we need to reach out to a generation like that through the media that they are familiar with and that they use. So this is the technology they are familiar with. We must reach them. So if you have your alpha, your gospel stories and your sermons, you must be available to them on YouTube. It must be available to them, by tweeting it to them, retweeting it, and so on, posting on social media, Instagram, and so on. We need to do that. Now, this technology that's been invented also helps us to enhance Bible study like never before. No longer is it expensive to buy commentaries and Bible dictionaries and all these tools to help us understand the Bible better, because it's all available. Bibletools.com, biblia.com, lots of technologies, biblegateway.com, and all these tools for studying the Bible and the Bible itself, many, many different translations of the Bible is all available on the internet. And so now we can study Bible study just like the scholars do without the costs that they have had to pay. I mean, we have Bible colleges with libraries that used to cost hundreds of thousands. Now it's free, and we have access to those books like never before. So why do we ignore the technology? We have to use it. We should use it. Yes, I know there are some Christians who will say, no, the technology will distract me from God, and I will go further and further away, and I will not use technology. And there are Christians like that, right? We live in Canada, we know of the Amish. It's really romantic, I think, to live simply like the Amish. I wish we all could. We don't need cars, we don't need telephones, we don't even need refrigerators. The Amish don't use any of that technology. So it's really nice. The movies about the Amish, oh, it's so cute. Oh, it's so romantic. But is it necessary? I don't judge the Amish people. They're Christians and they love God. Maybe they love God more than I do. And they're willing to live that simple faith and simple lives. And maybe we have too much materialism in our lives. But nonetheless, we can live simply, but we need to learn how to use the technology too. So having said these things, okay, the online worship, online communion even, all that is not against God's word, and we can freely use it. And the technology behind it is not evil. We can freely use it. We don't need to insist on going to church because that's not loving to our neighbor. And it is using technology that is not evil. So we should be free to use it. And finally, as to say it again, we may have freedoms where I'm free to decide I don't need a mask. I'm healthy and strong. I'm free to say I don't need a mask because it's my life. If I die, I go to God, I'm happy with it. But it's not my right I should insist on, but the right of my neighbor to live and to not fear the disease and not to fear death. And for me to love that neighbor to a point where he or she doesn't love this world, doesn't fear death, but love God and is not afraid of death. So the next point now I want to deal with, the next topic is more specifically vaccination. What is wrong with vaccination?
Change language.
Change topic. We have many people, and sadly many Christians, who say, and they're spreading the message that we should stay away from vaccination, and many reasons. I'll go through these reasons, and particularly where they use the Bible, I'm going to unravel all that confusion, hopefully for you. There are 4 reasons people give, not just Christians, but all sorts of people. But some of these are Christian arguments. The first one is not specifically Christian. So there are non-Christians who say, I don't vaccinate because it is not safe. And the second reason is Christians would say, we don't need the vaccine because that's trusting man. That's not trusting God. The vaccine is man's invention. I trust God. If God takes me home, hallelujah, I'm ready to go. So I'm not vaccinating. Third reason, it is immoral. You know how the vaccines are made is made by killing babies, and it's immoral, and so on and so forth. This is evil. I will have nothing to do with evil. And the fourth reason, it is deception by the Antichrist. The Antichrist is coming. He's going to use the vaccine and things like that to control us. And you know something? The vaccine has a robot, has a nano robot that will control you from inside. You don't know about it because you can't see it, so stay away from it. So these are the reasons why people, particularly Christians, but even non-Christians, because there are some non-Christians who say, I'm not going to be controlled by the government, so they are going to use this vaccine to control me. Even if they don't believe in nano robots, they'll say this vaccine is part of a system to control me. When the government says go, I must go. When the government says come, I must come. When the government says you all vaccinate, I must. Nope, I'm not going to do that. So there is a lot of pushback because I'm not going to be allowing the government to control me. For Christians, is even more, they would say, scriptural. The Bible talks about the Antichrist. The Antichrist is going to control the world. This is one way he's going to control the world. I am not going to allow him to do that. Okay, so these 4 reasons, I'll go through them next 2 weeks, probably. 1, it is not safe. 2, it is trusting man, not God. 3, it is immoral. 4, it is deception by the Antichrist. Stay away from it. First, it is not safe. Now, there are 2 types of people who object to vaccine. The first type of objection would be what I call the vaccine hesitant people. And the second group of people will be the anti-vaxxers, those who are just against vaccination. So one group hesitant, another group against, very strongly anti. So anti-vaxxers consist of 3 groups. The first group is those who don't trust any vaccine at all. So even the old vaccines, in Singapore, there's a compulsory vaccine for all babies. When they're born, they have a multiple vaccine injection and boosters that will be given as they grow through elementary school. Vaccines against rubella, against tuberculosis, against polio, diphtheria, whooping cough. These are all the vaccines that are compulsorily administered to every infant unless they cannot take it, medically. So these are vaccines that have actually eradicated a lot of disease in Singapore, and Singapore babies are one of the most blessed babies in the whole world. The infant mortality rate used to be very high in its 50s. Today is almost nothing because of the compulsory vaccination. But there are those who don't trust any vaccine at all, including these very good vaccines that have eradicated smallpox, for example. We have measles, and measles and so on, right? Now, there's another group, those who don't trust just the mRNA vaccine that is Pfizer and Moderna. These two vaccines use a new technology called mRNA, messenger RNA, and there are all kinds of fears about it. And the third group is those who are objecting to vaccines because they believe that the Bible tells them so. The biblical interpretation. All right, and we'll look at those biblical interpretations in detail. But first, this issue of vaccine hesitance. Some people are hesitant to do the vaccination because they say it is not tested, especially the mRNA is not tested. There are vaccines now that are based on old technology, what they call the inactive virus versions. Maybe it's not available in North America, but in the other parts of the world, the inactivated virus vaccines are from China, Sinovac, Sinopharm, the Russian vaccine, and so on. So we do have some people who said, I don't trust this because it has not been tested. Normal vaccines take years to test. This one just came out within a year. We're not going to trust it. I want to say that that's not true. The reason why all vaccines take long to test is because they have to test small groups of people at a time. Otherwise, if it's dangerous, it could kill off people. So they would, take samples of 1,000, maybe a few tens and hundreds first, and grow the numbers to 1,000 and more thousands. And finally, when it's really truly tested with a big enough sample, it's been 3-4 years plus, governments will always say, finish your test and send me the results. Where this emergency is concerned, governments have said, the regulators for vaccines have said, you keep sending the data to me as and when you test it, don't have to wait till the end of the campaign. And even in the experimenting stage, they have rapid approvals because it's an emergency time. But the reality is that it's not thousands that are being tested with the vaccine. There are now 2 billion shots already around the world. I just checked the latest figures. 2 billion, that's 2,000 million people, or rather, some of them have only one shot. But so at least, a few 100 million people with 2,000 million shots taken, and nobody has suffered any real serious or reported any really serious problem with it. So you have to realize that even if it has not taken years to test, the data on real vaccinations far exceeds any test that has ever been taken for any vaccine. So 2,000 million shots have been given to date and counting. There are some people who say, yeah, okay, one of the reasons why they wait sometimes is, after 3-4 years of testing, the first batch of people who tested in the first year, maybe by the 4th year, they get effects shown. The effect comes only years later. And we do not know because we're still within the first year of this pandemic, second year now. So maybe what if the effects are known only 5 years later, 10 years later. Well, I'm going to say that if there are effects 10 years later, I think our medicine, our doctors would have gone 10 years more in advance. And with technologies 10 years in advance, they will be able to cope with that. But the more important argument I have is that this is an emergency. We cannot expect normal timings. So even if we are guinea pigs in an emergency and we die or we have serious problems develop in our lives after taking the vaccination, we are doing it. Yes, we are guinea pigs, but we're doing it because even if we die, we are not afraid. We follow Jesus. But if we die, the data that is collected, if we have a serious effect, the data that is collected is going to save another life or many, many lives beyond this. So it's like the people who volunteer for the vaccine tests, the usual 3-4 year kind of vaccine test. If they die, if they get a serious problem, they're willing to do that because they know they're contributing to the advance of medical science. And they're willing to do it for us. We as Christians now, we are in this position where we are guinea pigs. We are being tested. We are the people testing the vaccine. But we are not alone anymore. There are 2 billion shots taken and hundreds of millions of people who are with us. We should not be afraid to die, whether from the disease or from the vaccine. Now, that is following Jesus. Jesus says we should be looking at him as a model. He died to save the whole world. And if we have that privilege of dying so that we can save parts of the world, I think that is following Jesus. We should not be afraid of death from the vaccine. Now, in any case, talking about death from the vaccine, the numbers are not scary. In the US and the UK, the figures are around 1,800, 1,700 people dying from COVID. Okay, this is not the vaccination yet. 1,800 people die from the COVID disease per million. In the European Union, is about 1,006 per million. That means for every million people who get the disease, 1,600 die. In Israel, it's 740. In Singapore, it's 5.4 for every million. The rate is very low. Compared to the deaths from vaccination. Okay, are there any deaths from vaccination? The worldwide figures and the websites are all these here. The data is being collected in all these. Some of these are the sources I've looked at. For 1 million people vaccinated, 19 people die. It's a very low rate of death. Far lower than the disease. 1,800 die per million who catch the disease. But for 1 million vaccinated, only 19 die. In Singapore, it's 0 deaths with nearly 4 million doses, 0 deaths. In Singapore, 34 people have died from the vaccine, from the disease. 34 people have died from the disease, but where the vaccination is concerned, 0. Yes, there are some people who claim that my so-and-so, my relative, or my friend's friend, my friend's relative, they died after the vaccine. We have to also look at this factor. Some people will die anyway, even if they did not have the vaccine. So the coincidence of having the death after the vaccine is just mere coincidence. The doctors have looked at the deaths that have happened after the vaccination, and they said the cause is not the vaccine. There are people, of course, no, I don't trust doctors. I don't trust governments. That's another story, okay? But as it is, the doctors, there's a very special panel of doctors who look at the deaths after vaccination in Singapore. And they have looked at every death that has happened. There are not that many, 4 or 5. And they say, no, the death does not come from the vaccine. Now, even if you are one of those who don't believe that the death wasn't from vaccine, just let me give you the US figures. There at the end, oh no, yeah, well, towards the end, May 24th, this is the latest figure from the date, May 24th. At that date, there were 285 million doses of vaccination in the US. And the claim is that there were 4,863 deaths. And I've seen many of the messages that go on WhatsApp and on YouTube and so on. Do you know there have been 4,863 deaths? It's a very big number. But we have to see in the context of 285 million doses. The percentage of death is therefore 17 deaths per million vaccinations. 17 deaths after 1 million people have been vaccinated. That's a very, very low risk. By saving people from dying, 1,800 people die per million. After vaccination, only 17 die. So it's safer to be vaccinated than to just stay away from the vaccine and die from the COVID. Now, of course, these figures in the US, they have also looked at them, and there is no causal link. The CDC in the US say 4,009 people may have died, but it wasn't the vaccine that killed them. The coincidence of dying after the vaccine, that's all it is. But even if you don't believe them, 4,008 deaths is just 0.0017% risk. And in the UK, they have reported 10 deaths out of 18 million people vaccinated as in April. This is a news report in April. I couldn't find any other later figures, but 10 deaths out of 18 million is 0.000056% risk. So small, so minuscule. There are people who, of course, don't believe governments, they don't believe statistics from the government, and they say, no death means somebody's hiding the figures, somebody's lying. I actually had a friend who showed me a live conversation with his American friends. They communicate and they say, in Singapore, we have had only at that stage, I think when I was looking at the debate, we had about 30 deaths out of about 65,000 people who had COVID, and only 30 deaths. And this American friend of my friend said, no, your government is hiding the deaths. Now, I think this is ridiculous, because they probably don't know that Singapore is just 700 square kilometers. It's smaller than even downtown Toronto. How can you hide the huge number of deaths if it's not 34, or if it's not 30? The hundreds of thousands that are supposedly dying and the government is secretly burying them. We have no space to bury people. We burn out, we cremate most of our dead bodies. Then the crematoriums will be crowded. We don't see that. So no, nobody is dying secretly and the figures are being hidden by the government. No, not at all. So there may be deaths. There may be deaths even after vaccination, but I want to emphasize that correlation is not the cause. So somebody may die after vaccination. He could have died from his diabetes, which he was on the verge of dying anyway. And I think recently there was an 80-something lady, I think, who died after vaccination. And she was just old. And she had a underlying disease, I think was a heart problem. So correlation, coincidence. It's not that the vaccine was the cause, it was a heart attack. In any case, even if we don't believe that, I think some people have died and nobody's telling us. We are in a situation where we have to realize that any medicine or any vaccine will never be 100% safe. Even the old vaccines, and they are time tested and technology is familiar and tested, they're not 100% safe. There will be somebody who will react and die from it, or react severely and need medical care after it. So with normal medications, with normal vaccines, we don't demand that they be 100% safe before we use them. We don't require that standard. Why do we require that of the COVID vaccine? If you're dying from cancer, won't you be willing to try a new experimental drug, even if it's experimental? We had just had a friend who was diagnosed with cancer, and she was asked, we have a new drug that we want to test. Would you consent to it? Would you be willing to go through this new vaccine, a new drug? She says, yes, of course. Why? Because when we are dying from cancer, even if it's experimental, we're willing to try it. So we are in a situation right now where it's almost like the whole world is dying, is going to potentially die from COVID if we don't act. And so, yeah, we are willing to experiment. In an emergency, we do have to take bigger risks so as to save as many as quickly as we can. And that's the only loving thing to do. Yes, vaccine hesitancy is understandable. The science is complicated. We are doubtful, we're confused, maybe even afraid of death and everything else. As Christians, I think we have to remember that our lives are in God's hands, with or without vaccines, with or without COVID. We could just walk out and a car runs into us and we're dead. God could call us back to him anytime. So let's not dwell on negative things. Let's not spread the negativity. Let's just continue to trust God, do what we can. God says, you have to take the precautions we need against disease. We don't just say, God, my life is in your hands. You take me, I don't do drugs. I don't do medication. I don't do treatments. You just take me when. No, we don't do that. If I'm sick, I go see the doctor. I try and get the hospitals to admit me so that they can heal me and cure me. So why don't we do that for COVID? And God uses medication. God uses doctors. God uses medical science, just as he uses miracles. We can be healed, and it's a miraculous healing even if God didn't just take away the cancer, right? So some of you know that my wife had cancer 40 years ago, and she had very, very faithful friends, faithful Christians who say, look, Dorothy, let's pray for you. God can take away your tumor. God can heal you. And she believed it, and she still does. God can take away that tumor and it disappears. My brother-in-law had a liver cancer tumor, and he prayed and God took it away without any medical interference, no medical intervention. So God can work through miracles, like in the case of my brother-in-law, and God can work through surgery. My wife went for surgery and the kidney was taken off. It had spread. She was actually at stage 4 cancer. And the doctor looked at it and took her off the kidney. She has lived for 40 years on one kidney, no cancer. He never came back. And that itself was a miracle. So we trust God to have miracles. And if he doesn't heal us through the doctors, he could take away the disease miraculously. But the doctor is itself a miracle. And so we should not dwell on negative things and not spread the negative, our fears and our negativity to other people. Ultimately, God is with us through the storm, every storm, any storm, and God will be with us after the storm. So even if you don't believe in vaccines, please don't use the Bible to support your stand. The Bible doesn't say you need to avoid doctors. The Bible doesn't say you need to avoid vaccines and medication. And one more thing I want to say is beware of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. What's that? In psychology, psychologists have studied this and they have come to this very stunning, surprising maybe to you, observation of human beings that they have looked at. The Dunning-Kruger effect the Dunning-Kruger effect essentially says that it's a psychological phenomenon. Yeah, the less you know, the more confident you are that you know, and the more you know, the experts who study many years, they are less confident than you would be. So you've got this person who knows very little who says, "Oh, I'm very sure," and this expert who studied many years will say, "I'm not that sure," because the more you know, the more you realize you know very little. So the expert is not as confident as this person here who is a lay person who says, "Oh, I know this, and therefore I am very sure." And I see a lot of that in this time of COVID, where people who actually know very little are so confident they know so much. And of course, they'll say, "Oh, I saw this YouTube video and I saw this internet article. I'm very sure." Who are you going to believe? The expert who studied the cases and the disease for data and the data for years and years and years, or this person who only read the internet article and the YouTube video? You decide for yourself. So next week, I will continue the second point about trusting man and not God. So right now, I just want to end here, stop sharing.